Introduction. So thank you everyone for coming to the first annual Environmental Justice Symposium hosted by the Undergraduate Environmental Union and specifically the Environmental Justice Campus Committee. This event is also co-sponsored by the Duke Conservation Tech, Muslim Student Association, Blue Devils United, and this specific talk is also hosted by Policy for the People, which is a leftist policy organization at Stanford. I will be one of your hosts. I'm Tyler, I'm a graduate student at Stanford, and our other host is Ashley Rosen, and she is the VP of the UEU. If you have questions for our speaker today, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will have a Q&A after the first talk. I am very honored to welcome our speaker, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute and the JFK School of Government at Harvard University. He is an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the job guarantee. And his work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. So this talk is called The Imperative of Colonial and Climate Reparations. Dr. Kaboub, take it away.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you, Ashley, for hosting this event and for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight virtually. I see some people also logging in from the Global South. I recognize a few names, so welcome. Thank you for joining us. Ashley or Taylor, can you confirm that you see a full screen on your end as opposed to the side? Okay, great, wonderful. So what I want to do today is make the case for a global Green New Deal framework that includes colonial and climate reparations as core features. And I will try to demonstrate today that we're actually doomed without climate reparations and colonial reparations. So here we go. Buckle up for this ride. Some of the slides will be quick, but I think will be very important for us to look at. So I want to start with some of the structural problems that the global South, developing countries in particular, in general have. So structural trade deficits that lead to massive amounts of external debt. And when I say external debt, I mean debt denominated in foreign currencies. And I'll use some examples here. So foreign currencies like the US dollar, like euros, like Japanese yen and British pounds. These are the currencies that dominate the composition of foreign debt for countries in the global South. The root causes of that foreign debt, the root causes of trade deficits are three structural deficiencies. The first one is energy deficits. Most countries in the global South have to import their energy resources, which is mostly fossil fuels. And this is, by the way, true even for the big oil exporters in the global South, because they export crude oil and they end up importing the refined petrochemicals, the gasoline, the kerosene, and the petrochemicals, which are higher value added products, which means more expensive than the crude oil that they actually export, which means you're constantly losing in that trade. The second feature is food deficits. That is, most of the countries in the global South depend on food imports from the global North. Part of this has to do with the post-colonial economic policies that the US and the European Union and Japan and Australia and other countries have implemented in the global trading system to restrict food imports from former colonies and to subsidize food production in Europe and the US and so on, which destroyed the farming capabilities in the global South. The third component, which is the most challenging one, is the low value added content of industrialization in the global South. In other words, most countries in the global South now specialize in producing, manufacturing low value added content products. That is to say, you know, this kind of technology that we all have on our desks and our pockets, the value added content that's embedded in it includes low cost labor to assemble it, but includes the higher value added content, which is the intellectual property, the engineering and innovation capabilities, which is mostly the specialty of the global North. and the global south is simply the assembly line. That kind of industrialization is a trap, and the global south is trapped into that trap. So these three features lead to these structural trade deficits, which even if you're not an economist or an econ major in this conversation, in simple terms, when a country has a trade deficit, the value of its currency falls relative to the dollar, relative to the euro, relative to the British pound. So now your currency is weaker, which means if the next day your country needs to import medicine or to import food or energy or any technology from abroad, you're going to import it at a higher cost, which means you're literally importing inflated prices for your food and energy and medicine and so on. And if you don't do anything about it to subsidize food and fuel prices, you're going to have riots, literally food riots the next day. And you're going to exclude people from access to healthcare, access to transportation, access to energy, access to food, which is socially and politically destabilizing. So in order to avoid that social and political unrest that is typically fueled with currency devaluation, what do countries do in the global south? They end up borrowing from the IMF, from the World Bank, from international lenders, borrowing US dollars, which they can't generate internally. And because this is a structural problem that persists for decades, your borrowing is increasing every year, right? So these are the traps that I'm describing here. And if we're going to be successful at tackling the global challenges that we're facing today, including climate challenges, inequality challenges, we have to undo these structural problems and repair them once and for all. And what I'll argue today is that some of these traps are not accidental. They happen because of the colonial history and because of the post-colonial or neo-colonial extraction of wealth and resources from the global south. So that's really the main premise of identifying the structural problems that we have. So a quick history of how this happened. Post-independence, in most developing countries, you have state-led economic development. That is, the state took over the responsibility of building infrastructure, funding schools, and so on. The next step was import substitution industrialization in the 50s and 60s, mostly in Latin America and Africa and Asia, whereby developing countries specialized in producing things that they would normally import from the global north. The problem is they ended up specializing in the obsolete technologies and the products that the global north didn't want to produce anyway. So that created that initial trap of import substitution industrialization. Export-led growth in the 1970s. The idea was if you industrialize and you export more to the global north, because the global north opened its markets for free trade in everything but arms and farms, right? That was the slogan of the 1970s. We're free to trade manufactured goods, all you want, but not food and not weapons. Well, weapons for obvious reasons, but food because this was the strategy to build food security in Europe and the US and Australia and so on, and destroy the food security of the global south. So farmers went bankrupt because they couldn't export to Europe anymore. They couldn't export to the US. They couldn't export to the global north in general. So export-led growth was in manufacturing only. And what kind of manufacturing? It's the assembly line for the global supply chain, which means cheap labor racing to the bottom in terms of environmental standards and labor standards to take those outsourced jobs from the global north, the obsolete technologies that the global north didn't want to keep using. This led to the debt crisis of the 1980s because all of that borrowing that the global south was accumulating was unsustainable. This is borrowing in foreign currencies without any economic outcome that would actually allow the global south to get out of the poverty trap. How do we deal with the global crisis, with the debt crisis? Structural adjustment programs. These are the famous IMF, strings attached that come with the loan that say, we'll give you a rescue loan, but you have to implement these neoliberal economic reforms, privatize state government, state-owned enterprises, and open up your economy and so on. So the neoliberal reforms are today known as austerity policies, which means debt restructuring. We'll stretch out the payments, but you're going to have to pay anyway. We'll privatize state-owned enterprises, government-owned Utilities like the power company, the water company, the airport, the airlines, all of those have been privatized. Why privatized? You sell them, you generate dollars to pay the debt. But that's it. You can't privatize the electricity company again once you've sold it, right? Labor market flexibility. This is the favorite one from the World Bank. In other words, let your workers race to the bottom with lower wages, with lower labor standards. You know, get rid of labor unions. Businesses don't like labor unions. Again, the race to the bottom. Foreign direct investment, we're told, and export-led growth will help the economy grow and grow you out of poverty. The problem with foreign direct investment, it's only interested in cheaper labor, and it's only interested in the assembly line type of manufacturing. Export-led growth, the problem with it is the faster you try to export, the more imports you have to bring in terms of energy to fuel your industrialization, in terms of importing the high value added technology, capital equipment, intermediate goods to be assembled by low paid labor. So it's also a trap. You end up importing more than what you export in value added. Financial liberalization, in other words, set up a mini Wall Street, attract the speculators of the world. Well, we know how that goes. Buy low and sell high, and then the economy crashes because they're not coming in for real economic activity. They're coming in for speculative purposes. We've seen it in Mexico, we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in South Africa and other places. It's an immediate rush of money to speculate, and then they get out and you have a crash and 10 years worth of crisis to undo afterwards. Tourism, we're told, open your economy to tourists. They'll bring dollars and they'll create economic activity. But here's the problem with tourism. You bring millions of tourists, you have to feed them. So you import more food, which you don't have, and you have to import more energy to heat and cool the hotels and transport them back and forth. So it's also a trap from an economic standpoint, but it's also an environmental trap for many countries. And then you're not the only country with tourism. There's another 120 countries with beautiful weather and sites and so on. So you're also racing to the bottom in terms of standards for labor and environmental and so on. So these are, all of these supposed solutions of neoliberal policies are long-term traps. These are the neo-colonial traps that I'm trying to convey here. Remittances, in other words, export your best and brightest to the global north. They'll find jobs, they'll send money back home, and those are dollars that can fuel your economy. Well, that's the brain drain, right? And with the restrictions on immigration the last couple of decades, this is not a sustainable solution to send your best and brightest, your doctors, your engineers, your technicians. It's not a development strategy, it's a trap, right? And it benefits the global north. So it's an endless race to the bottom. All of these supposed solutions from the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO are structural traps that continue to perpetuate the colonial structure that was established during colonial days. So more external debt, more austerity, and we're told there is no alternative. I'll give you just one example. I picked Bolivia randomly because I was looking at Bolivia the other day. These are Bolivia's exports. What do you notice? It's all almost raw materials completely and a little bit of tourism, right? Low value added content, global south, typical racing to the bottom, right? Mining for gas and petroleum and gold and zinc and things like that. What are Bolivia's imports? High value added content, cars, technology, computers, medical equipment. So you export low value added content, raw materials, you import high value added content. It's a typical trap. I can show you country after country after country. This is how the system was established to force the global south to continue the colonial extraction of the last 200 plus years. The problem with this model, even if you're a massive exporter and you happen to be blessed with the best resources, gold and rare earth materials and whatever, the prices of those commodities you can't control. So they go up and then they come down. And when they come down, you're starved of resources and you have to literally starve your people or borrow more money internationally to feed your people, to import medicine, to import technology, and so on. And all the solutions that I laid out are traps that are put in place to keep countries in this position. So zooming back out, away from Bolivia and the global south, globally, this is what we're dealing with in terms of climate issues. This is a map of water stress. the data just speaks for itself. I'm not going to do a climate science presentation today. I think most people are aware of the challenges we're facing. Water stress is important because it fuels climate migration, and it fuels the climate refugee crisis, which we will live through in the next 30 years. These are happening now. This is not the future. This is a study of current climate-induced movements of people. So the blue dots are, the orange dots are conflicts, political conflicts, wars, and so on. The blue dots are climate events that are forcing people to move. And of course, there's an overlap. The Syrian crisis started with a massive drought. 1.5 million people moved to the big cities before the conflict. Why? Because their livelihood was destroyed, right? Because 85% of the cattle died, because farmers had no livelihood left. So they moved to the cities. And what happens when large people move to cities? More pressure on housing, more pressure on schools, more pressure on government services. And the weaker the government infrastructure, the more instability, the more prone to political conflicts and unrest and so on. Syria is not unique. This is going to happen in many, many places in the world. Don't take my word for it. This is the World Bank, not your tree huggers, right? The World Bank is looking at this and they're saying this is going to happen by 2050. We're estimating 85 million people in Africa and millions of people around the world will be forced to move because of climate events. So we're talking about climate refugees. And of course, when millions of people move, I mean, remember how many people moved from Syria to Europe and the whole world panicked? That's nothing, right, compared to the numbers that we're talking about, adding to economic and political instability. So inaction today is dangerous, is unaffordable. I'm originally from Tunisia, from the Middle East region. So that part of the world, we know for a fact, possibly 300 million people will have to move at least during the summer months by 2050. These are studies that are telling us the region will be uninhabitable during these extreme heat waves that are anticipated by 2050. That's within our lifetime. That's within your lifetime. JP Morgan, again, not the tree huggers. JP Morgan and other investment banks on Wall Street, the last couple of years started looking at the IPCC report. The IPCC report that told us we have 12 years to go to take massive climate mitigation action. They did look at it and they came out with internal reports, some of which were public, some of which were leaked to the media eventually. And they said those IPCC guys, they're optimistic. It's much worse than what they're saying. They're panicking. And as a result, they're applying pressure on the US government, quietly, on the Federal Reserve Bank, on the European Central Bank to take action because those climate risks, not because they like trees or because they like clean air, maybe they do, but because they know the financial risks of climate inaction are massive, and those risks are currently on their books. They're actually going to foot the bill for inaction. So they want intervention to minimize the risk that's literally sitting on their books right now. So the Union of Concerned Scientists did this study a couple years ago, and they just looked at real estate properties in coastal cities in the US that will be flooded. And they estimated the loss to be $1 trillion worth of what we call stranded assets. Stranded assets are assets that are very valuable today, $1 trillion worth of real estate that will be worth nothing in 2050, while they actually picked 2045 as their target year. Right? That's just the US, there's just coastal properties. Imagine all the coastal properties around the world and all the economic losses from climate events that will have massive implications. All the fossil fuel infrastructure, the unburnable carbon that we know for a fact we are not going to be able to burn. The value of oil companies and gas companies, it's priced into their market value today. Their proven reserves are assumed to be burnable and are worth trillions of dollars. And what we're saying is we're not going to have to, we can't afford to extract and burn those assets. So the market value of those companies is going to crash. So this is what we're talking about, stranded assets. This is what we call the carbon bubble. It's like a financial market, stock market bubble, but this is a carbon bubble that will burst. And the massive losses are mostly going to hit Wall Street, financial institutions, insurance companies, and the global north. point number 2, going back to the global south. If we take the global south and global north and divide them into, just 2 groups, and we net out all the financial transactions going from, all over the world between global north and global south, including exports, imports, foreign direct investment, loans, interest payments, debt cancellation, even charity donations, all of that. We net the full amount. What this data is showing us here, if you look at the green bar right here, measured on this axis, we're talking about $2 trillion as of, this is, I think, 2017, this data, $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. This is the neo-colonial extraction of wealth that I'm talking about, $2 trillion. There is no way we can meet the climate challenge, the inequality challenge, if we're constantly sucking $2 trillion from the poorest countries in the world, right? So somehow we need to reverse that. And that is going to be the starting point for my case for climate and colonial reparations, right? Transfer of financial resources to reverse the flow. Notice this is not new. The trend started in the 1990s. The net amount moving from the poorest to the richest countries, right? And if we don't do anything about the global financial system today, and we look at this picture in 5 years and 10 years, I guarantee you this amount will be 5, 6, 10, maybe $trillion moving from the poorest to the richest countries, because it's a constant trend. It slowed down a little bit with the financial crisis, but it's a constant extraction. And this is more powerful than the actual colonial extraction, because you don't have to have troops and foreign invasion. This is done through free trade and economic activity, right? So that's how dangerous this, and that's how unsustainable this trend is. So global income distribution. Again, this is the thing about the global Green New Deal or a New Deal, even in the US context. It's about undoing the unsustainable levels of inequality that we have globally, that we have at the national level. But then the mirror image of this picture, which is just income distribution, is this, the CO2 emissions. It's the richest people who emit the most, right, globally. And this should not be a surprise to many of you. So here I'm trying to build the case for who's going to pay for this reparation. Who's responsible for most of the damage? Colonial damage, neo-colonial damage, and ecological damage. Whose carbon footprint is the largest historically and at the present moment, so we can compensate the victims of climate change, right? The climate refugees and their communities. The data speaks for itself. And I can go through a handful of these slides. You'll notice China and India are recent comers at this big carbon emission, but most of what they produced is actually consumed in the global north, right? So it's still the carbon footprint of the global north. And this picture gives you a little bit of the carbon footprint. So there's plenty of data that we can trace all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Who started and who did most of the carbon emission? It's clearly the global north. So the global north is responsible mostly for colonial damage, mostly for the carbon damage to the planet. And it's still to this day extracting $2 trillion a year from the poorest countries. This is unsustainable, right? It needs to be reversed. It needs to be repaired. I have a few more slides of carbon data. So I mentioned carbon bubbles and carbon asset. There's lots of different studies and different estimates. I'm going to give you just the most conservative numbers that are out there. Some of the numbers put it at $100 trillion at least. It's possible. But the conservative numbers are talking about 20 to 30 trillion dollars, mostly in the global north. Oil and gas, we're talking about up to $4 trillion at least, and $1 trillion, as I said earlier, in just real estate assets. So these are the losses that we're facing. And if we don't do anything, these losses will be bigger and bigger, right? So, oops, a global Green New Deal. Can we afford it? How are we going to pay for it, right? This is where I bring in modern monetary theory, or MMT, which is one of my areas of expertise. So what is MMT? What does it say in terms of how do we pay for these massive, expensive climate mitigation programs, both in the global north and in the global south? The case that I'm trying to make here is that the global north actually has the financial capability to pay for their own Green New Deals and also to pay for reparations. That's the case that I'm trying to make. And that the global south, by definition, is losing trillions of dollars every year, doesn't have the financial resources, has these structural weaknesses that I highlighted earlier, was not responsible for any of this damage to begin with, and doesn't have the technological capabilities to decarbonize and transition into clean energy. So all the case is there for the global north to actually be responsible and pay for, in terms of financial compensation, but also in terms of transfer of technology to the global south to rapidly decarbonize and rebalance the global economy ecologically and economically. So a quick introduction to MMT just to demonstrate what I mean by the global north is capable of paying for this. So MMT talks about monetary sovereignty. This is not political or territorial sovereignty. This is about the spending capacity of the national authority, of the government. We put countries on a spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have high degrees of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have low degrees of monetary sovereignty or no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. So a country like the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, the UK, all of these countries have very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, which means they have plenty of spending capacity to have their own Green New Deals and also to transfer resources to pay for reparations and so on. Countries on the other end of this spectrum, a best example would be a country like Ecuador, which has no monetary sovereignty because it literally doesn't issue its own currency. It uses the US dollar. It's like the equivalent of a state or a company or a nonprofit in the US because it doesn't have any monetary sovereignty. Most countries in the global south that we're talking about today are somewhere in the middle. What determines where they stand on that spectrum is the level of external debt that they have. How much have they borrowed from the IMF, from the World Bank, from private institutions? And that's what constrains their spending capacity. And they're in that position because of those structural colonial and post-colonial problems that I highlighted in the beginning. So monetary sovereignty, a country with high degree of monetary sovereignty like the US issues its own currency, taxes its population in the same national currency. And number three, very important, only issues bonds or debt denominated in the national currency. The US doesn't have any foreign debt. All the US national debt is in US dollars, which the US government can always manage and honor. And then finally, you don't fix your currency to gold or silver or any foreign currency. In other words, you have a flexible exchange rate. Countries that have that high degree of monetary sovereignty have massive spending capacity that they're not tapping into. And we're saying that's what we're going to use to fund Green New Deals all over the world and to fund this climate reparations and colonial reparations. A key distinction for MMT is between the issuer of the currency, that's the national government, versus the rest of us users of the currency. You and I can't do this, right? Well, we can't spend money into existence. We have to earn it in order to spend it. So in other words, don't try this at home. This is for national governments. All right. So what is the limit of government spending according to MMT? Well, we're told, well, you need to collect taxes. You need to borrow from lenders and so on. Well, MMT says the real limit, there's this additional spending capacity, this bright yellow space that we're not tapping into. That's not unlimited. We're not just saying government print unlimited amounts of money. We're saying it is constrained by that red bar, which is the risk of inflation. And according to MMT, the risk of inflation is determined by two things. And these are critical, both for economic and political reasons at the global level that we need to highlight. One is an economic constraint, which is the lack of productive capacity. If you don't have the capacity to produce food and you have more demand for food, you're going to have inflation. If you don't have the capacity to produce energy and there's more demand for energy, you're going to have inflation. The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can build more resources. We can train more people. And that allows us to expand the productive capacity and as a result, push the risk of inflation away further out. The second one is the most important one, which is what I call the abusive market power and price setting behavior of key corporations who can raise prices simply because they can, because they have too much market power, right? Think of big pharma in the US, think of big tech, think of the oil companies and so on. They have too much market power and regulators, government regulators, let them have it. Why? Because they fund their campaigns because of XYZ and everything you know. That kind of market power, that kind of inflation is not going to go away by not decarbonizing. It's not going to go away by not spending more on things that we need. It only goes away if you tax and regulate their market power out of existence. In other words, if you make those markets more democratic, more competitive, which is why we have antitrust laws, which is why we regulate, which is why we tax. So why would super PAC sponsored senators and congressmen and MPs tax and regulate the hands that feed them, right? So this is a question about democracy. If we're going to have a Green New Deal in the US or a global Green New Deal, it's not going to happen without democratizing the system, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. That's critical. And MMT shines this bright light on this world of possibilities that's being hidden from us. These are the forces that suffocate the spending capacity of the government, that don't allow us to build more capacity, that don't allow us to democratize the market because of vested interests. So MMT zooms in on the risk of inflation as the real constraint. And the real constraint has these political dimensions and corruption dimensions and so on. So this is the paradigm shift that I'm hoping many of you will be introduced to today. So what do mainstream economists say about inflation? These are the economists who tell us we can't have reparations, we can't have a Green New Deal, we can't massively decarbonize because it's too expensive, because it's going to cause hyperinflation like Venezuela and Zimbabwe and all of that. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, those are the countries with no monetary sovereignty. Of course they have inflation because they have no productive capacity, because they have massive external debt and so on. So don't take it from me. This guy retired from the Fed 2 weeks later, came out and said this publicly. The Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. Translation in plain English, we have no idea what causes inflation, right? Because we have massive government deficits, large national debt, and mainstream theory says this has caused inflation. What we're dealing with is deflation in the US, in Japan, in the European Central Bank, all over the world, right, in the last 10 years. This is, again, don't take it from me, this is the ECB. Their forecast for inflation based on mainstream theory of inflation versus what actual inflation is, completely off for the last 10 years. They have no idea what causes inflation, right? MMT offers an alternative that's reliable and so on. So the standard theory says if we spend too much, it's going to cause inflation. Look at Japan. For 3 decades, massive government spending, deficits, the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world, 260%, I believe, at this point. And Japan has negative interest rates and has deflation, not high interest rates and hyperinflation like the mainstream theory says. So MMT does this clear distinction between countries on this end of the spectrum, like Japan, the US, and so on, and countries like Venezuela and Bolivia and Tunisia and Egypt and so on. So a very different analytical framework that tells us we know that Japan can afford it, the US can afford it without causing inflation. In other words, this is not going to bankrupt the world. We know who can do it. And it just so happens that the countries that can do it are actually the ones who are responsible for carbon emissions and the ones who are responsible for colonial damage and the ones who are responsible for neo-colonial extraction. So we have the legal framework that says you cause the damage, you pay for it. And we know that you can afford it. That's really the main idea. So what MMT does at the national level is that it decouples the spending from the need to tax. At the local level, your local municipality, they need to tax in order to spend. They can borrow a little bit up to a certain limit, but that's it. They're like you and I. They have to generate revenues. The federal government, national governments like the Japanese, the UK government, and so on, they don't need to tax this to pay for that. They have that additional bright yellow space, additional spending capacity. So what do we say? Spend on national priorities, which include climate damage reparations and so on, colonial reparations. And then tax to decarbonize. Yes, tax pollution, tax speculators, tax extreme wealth, not because we need their money or their permission to pay for reparations, but because we want to decarbonize. We want to reduce speculation. We want to protect democracy from the oligarchs who have too much power and influence in politics. Those are good reasons to tax, but not because we need their money or their permission to fund a reparations program or a climate mitigation program and so on. So these are the reasons for taxation. Tax to reduce the abusive market power that I talked about, tax and regulate. Hashtag goals. This is really the framework that we should be thinking of as climate activists, as organizers, as policymakers. And then shift the narrative. Can we afford this? Are these things affordable? When they say, oh, we can't afford a global Green Deal, it's too expensive, we don't have the money, call their bluff, right? Is this affordable, right? Call their bluff. Is this cheap? Is this affordable? Is this the quality of life we aspire for? So in other words, we really need to shift the narrative in terms of what is affordable and so on. And one of the biggest challenges we have, especially in the economics profession and the general public, is that we use the wrong metric to talk about these investments. We use GDP, gross domestic product, to measure economic growth. And every politician will tell you, we need economic growth so we can generate wealth, so we can fund all of these nice programs for green energy and transition and all of that. The problem is GDP includes the value of all the negative effects of pollution. Every time we clean an oil spill, we spend $500 million to clean the ocean. GDP goes up by $500 million. And it gets celebrated on TV as, yay, this is more economic growth. Every time we go for medical treatment because of breathing conditions, because of cancer treatment, goes up, GDP goes up by that amount. And say, yay, more economic growth. Our quality of life is being destroyed. The environment is being destroyed, and it's celebrated on TV as economic growth. Every time we build a prison, GDP goes up. It gets celebrated on TV as good news, right? We need to shift the narrative. So many of my colleagues, ecological economists and others, have developed alternative ways of measuring the real quality of life as opposed to GDP. And Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, is one of those indicators. This is the data for the US. If you strip all of those negative effects from GDP, you get the pure quality of life. It's been flat for the last 40 years. No improvement in quality of life whatsoever, but GDP is certainly going up. So we need to change the metric and shift the narrative about what really matters. And once you do that and you say, we want to focus on quality of life, then all the investments that we're talking about in the green movement and the sunrise movement become obvious. If you want quality of life to go up, then you invest in health, you invest in clean energy, you invest in communities that have been neglected for decades. That's how you get the better quality of life. So those are the metrics that we need to implement internationally. This should be the metric for a global Green New Deal, to assess the success of a global Green New Deal. So colonial and ecological reparations, anybody in the reparations literature will tell you that every time you talk about reparations, we're talking about three things. One is telling the truth. Two is offering a public apology. Three is the actual reparations, which involves structural reparations and monetary compensation. So at the global level, for this colonial and ecological reparations, we have examples of truth and reconciliation commissions that we've seen in South Africa and Yugoslavia and other parts of the world, and Tunisia and other parts of the world. The purpose of truth and reconciliation commissions is not to take half the world and put it in prison. It's really a restorative justice type of vision that says we're all in this together. We need to know what happened. We need to know who's responsible. We need to heal together and move on, right? So a network of global truth and reconciliation commissions is needed around the world to hear the pain and the suffering that people are still facing to this day. A formal apology at the regional, national, international level to recognize that this is unacceptable. And then once you offer the apology, you have to step up and actually repair the damage. And reparations means monetary compensation, as in transfer of financial resources from the global north to the global south, to reverse that $2 trillion worth of theft from the global south that perpetuates the colonial structures, and structural reparations that actually undo those structural weaknesses that I started this presentation with. You start number one with debt cancellation. Cancel the debt, external debt. Global financial system reparations, so that you stop the vacuum cleaner that we have at the global level that sucks $2 trillion from the system. And global climate mitigation, right, to actually fund the decarbonization in the global south in particular. Transfer of technology, and tax and regulate abusive market power everywhere, because now we're talking about a global corporate system that exceeds the capacity of governments even to regulate. And I'll close with this slide and take questions. The legal framework for this, we have legal precedents. We have the odious debt doctrine, which has been used for the last 100 years, only used by countries like the US, by the way. It's a very simple concept that says a debt can be canceled if three factors apply. One, if the money was borrowed without the consent of the people, say by a dictator, right? Number two, if the money was used not to benefit the people by a corrupt government. And number three, most important one, if the lenders knew about it, if the lenders knew that it was a corrupt government not benefiting the people, that debt should be canceled. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt cancellation is on the table right now. But who's going to step up and do it, right? Countries that transition from military regimes and dictatorship, to this day, they still continue paying that debt that was known by bankers, by governments in the global north were supporting dictatorship, including in my own home country in Tunisia, to this day, paying for that debt. Colonial reparations. There are some examples of minor cases of colonial reparations, but they're mostly symbolic and don't include structural reparations. Well, here's a little bit of money, go away, don't talk to us anymore, don't complain. War reparations, right, in Europe and other parts of the world. The principle of necessity and the principle of impossibility. These are legal principles in international law that can be activated, can be used by legal scholars to make the case for debt cancellation, for reparations. It's very simple. I mean, if you go to law school and you take your intro classes or whatever, these are basic concepts that you learn. The principle of impossibility is like, if I booked this venue from you to host a concert, right? And I have a contract, we have a deal. I said, on the 30th, I'm showing up with my band and I sold tickets, but then there's a fire and the building, it just doesn't exist anymore. And I show up and say, wait a minute, I have a contract. You need to give me the venue right now. It's impossible. There is no building. So in a court of law, you're not responsible for not honoring your contract. So there are many, many applications for debt cancellations, for climate reparations, to make the case for the principle of impossibility. And a lot of it has to do with human rights. If your people are literally going to die, they're becoming climate refugee because the Pacific island is literally sinking and has no access to water, it is impossible to live in that environment. So there are many, many cases that can use these principles to make the case, country by country, of course, but we have the legal framework to do this. And then finally, to conclude, we have less than 10 years to go, if we're lucky. The climate policies that the climate crisis, inequality, all of these problems that we have are calling for urgent and bold actions, not small symbolic, we'll give you a little bit of money to compensate for a climate damage or whatever. I mean, to be honest, even Bernie Sanders' climate fund, what was it, $175 billion? So we'll give you $175 billion and then we'll suck out $2 trillion and we call it climate action. So we're talking about massive intervention is needed immediately. The current policies and proposals are too weak, too slow, too expensive, ineffective, and dangerous in the long term in terms of their impact. So a global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations at the scale that I'm describing is possible, desirable, and affordable. And with that, I'm gonna stop here and take your questions. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Round of applause. Let me do my little
Thank you.
Round of applause. Yes, there's
digital applause.
Yes, digital applause. So I can see some great questions in the chat. Let's go to the first one. It's about financial sovereignty for countries like those in West Africa who are considering moving off the Central African franc and to currencies like the echo. Does that increase the financial sovereignty of those countries and give them space to do some of this MMT spending themselves while the global north gets its act together?
Very good question. And Ashley or Taylor, if you can drop one of those links in the chat, the one that's from the Tax Justice Network, which just came out a couple of days ago. It's a special issue that I contributed a piece to that includes some of the content that I presented today. But my colleague, Ndongo Samba Sila, wrote a piece on the CFA franc and the colonial currency, the French colonial currency that still exists in the region. Highly recommended piece. And in general, Ndongo's work is fantastic in that area. The short answer is no. Moving from the CFA to the ECHO will not change anything. It's just changing the label, and it's exactly the same monetary system. What I'm describing here is undoing the structures, the economic structures that limit the productive capacity, that force many of those countries to specialize in the same extractive industries that the colonial authorities used during colonial times. That's why I showed the case of Bolivia, because it's a classic case. It's as if Bolivia is still colonized. Regardless of which government, leftist government, right-wing government, the economic structure is the same. And it's a classic case in many developing countries. So I will be the first one to tell you, the MMT lens that I presented is an analytical lens that highlights the weaknesses. And if you don't address the root causes of the weakness, it's still going to be there. So what would be an MMT-informed solution to economic development problems in West Africa and other parts of the global South? Address the food deficit situation, which means implement sustainable agricultural policies to claim or reclaim food sovereignty and food security. That's plugging one major hole in your external balance. The second major hole is your energy, lack of energy sovereignty, which means invest in renewable energy, food, energy security domestically, so that you can plug that secondary hole. So part of climate reparations that I'm arguing here to repair the model that perpetuates the cycle is transfer of technology and financial resources in order to build resilience in food security, build resilience in energy security. That's one core aspect of that reparation. So I'll leave it at that. And there's quite a bit of literature on this, including a couple of pieces that I put in the chat earlier. And Ndongo Samba Sila's work is fantastic in this space.
The next question, I think, is a good follow-up on that one. It is, how much global coordination do you expect is necessary to successfully limit corporate power instead of shifting it to less regulated countries?
None of this will happen without global coordination. It's not going to be one country from the global South saying we need climate reparations going to happen. We need to, that's why I call for truth and reconciliation commissions, right? To tell the truth and bring those who are responsible to actually admit their role historically and at the present moment in this. And I say this because I am personally convinced that, you ask me, is this going to happen tomorrow? Probably not. But the closer we get to the more severe climate crisis events that will actually cause massive financial losses on Wall Street. And that's why I highlighted the panic by insurance companies, by financial institutions, because they know they need to act right now, not in 10 or 20 years. The closer we get to more pressure on them, more pressure on people at the top of the income groups in terms of seeing the material losses, seeing the refugees crossing borders in the millions, the closer we get to recognizing that there is no alternative. There is no alternative to repairing the damage, right? I'd rather have us do it now, but I'm realist in terms of, I understand the geopolitical balance of power globally and so on. But as we speak, countries in the global South are actually organizing around these themes, believe it or not. One of the success stories of MMT is highlighting these structural weaknesses, connecting the dots between the past colonial times, the neo-colonial times, and the present crisis moment. And the COVID crisis just exposed this whole thing, right? When you shut down tourism, when you shut down international trade, what happened in the global South is complete isolation, right? Because of the industrialization structure, because of the excessive reliance on food imports, energy imports, and tourism and all of that. So if you go, I'm going to put this in the chat, to mes-africa.org, you'll see our open letter there for calling for economic and monetary sovereignty, reclaiming economic and monetary sovereignty in Africa. There is a series of networks, this is just one of them, all over the African continent and the broader global South that are organizing around this. And they're not organizing to tell governments what to do. This is organizing to mobilize people to have an alternative vision for what is possible. The mainstream theory tells us a better world is not possible. It's not affordable. We don't have the money for it, right? In other words, we're doomed. MMT is saying, wait a minute, there is a world of possibilities, like ready to be tackled. And then it tells us what the real constraints are. The constraints are the colonial and neo-colonial extractive structures, and the constraints are the corrupt, abusive price-setting behavior at the national and international level. And if we're mobilized to organize to push back against those constraints, then we have a world of possibilities. And what I'm suggesting here is really nothing new. I'm just putting together, ideas that have been around for a long time and trying to organize it in a meaningful, comprehensive way to for people to organize around it. I'd rather have well-informed pitchforks than have just angry pitchforks at the system and not offering any alternative solution other than saying the current system is abusive, is not sustainable. And I'm trying to offer that there is a way out only if we organize around these particular demands. So we're not asking for charity, we're asking for actual reparation.
The next question in the chat is, are there industries or other entities who are poised to actually profit from climate change and will work against all of the different strategies that we've talked about today?
Well, if you asked me a while ago, I may have said Wall Street, but it's not the case, right? Everything that I mentioned today about stranded assets, about financial risks to the system, nobody's going to benefit in the long term from climate disasters, right? Not people in the global South, not people in the global North. And I think that's where we're sort of united on this. People in the climate movement all of a sudden are getting their interest aligned in an awkward, weird way with Wall Street, who's now asking governments for climate action, not because they're tree huggers, but because they care about their money, because they care about the financial risks, which is fine as long as but do we want Wall Street to develop a global framework for climate mitigation, or do we want a social justice movement to design the terms of a global Green New Deal? That's what I'm talking about here. Wall Street will definitely not be in favor of reparations the way I'm describing it. They're not in favor of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They're not in favor of any of this. They're trying to do whatever it takes, as little as possible, to save their balance sheets, to protect their wealth. The World Economic Forum, with their great reset, because now they acknowledge inequality is a problem, climate change is a problem, all of these things are a problem. So they're proposing a great reset. Reset of what? A reset from the top 1% perspective, or a reset from a global South climate justice, social justice perspective? So if we don't have an alternative and the only offer on the table is the great reset from the World Economic Forum and Wall Street and insurance companies, then they're not going to deliver any social justice for us. They're going to do the minimum amount to window dress the policies to tell us we're dealing with this, but in fact, we're not.
The next question is there anything citizens can do to push for this structural change?
Yes, absolutely. If you are inspired by anything that you've seen here today, follow your passion in whatever particular area. If it's activism in the US, if it's calling their bluff in the economics profession, if it's highlighting the colonial and neo-colonial history, if we believe in the democratic process, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, for the US government to use its massive spending capacity, not to enrich the 1%, not to enrich pharmaceutical companies and big tech and big oil, then hold them accountable. Introduce them to these ideas if they happen to be ignorant of the possibilities, and many of them are not. Send them the first warning and then vote them out if they don't. I mean, your life depends on it. My life depends on it. My kids, your kids will live possibly as climate refugees in their lifetime, or will be welcoming climate refugees. So these things are serious. And I hope that we do whatever we can in our little ways to shift the narrative about what is possible, because we're told none of this is possible. It's too expensive, right? We're not responsible for it. And when I say reparations, by the way, I'm talking global reparations today. There are reparations within the US that are owed for slavery, for indigenous people. There are reparations that are owed in the global South, also by governments who abuse their own people. So that's why I'm talking about a network of global truth and reconciliation commissions, so that we heal and move forward, right? Because there is no way out of this. And all the climate science, all the forecasting is so depressing, and including the Wall Street forecasting is so depressing, that I think we have no other alternative other than actual reconciliation and acknowledging the damage, as opposed to window dressing with a little bit of charity and say, we'll manufacture the solar panels here and we'll donate some of them to the global South, or we'll sell them at a discount. That's just a joke.
Do you have an estimate for the cost of the wealth transfer from the global North that will be necessary for these reparations and other policies, aside from debt cancellation?
Very good question. This is something that I'll be working on next year, hopefully during my sabbatical. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of framework, it's about estimating that yellow space and that additional spending capacity for every country. And that's a massive amount of work. So I'll be developing just the methodology for it, not the actual data. It takes a small army of economists and statisticians to do this. But the data that's very straightforward to calculate is the carbon reparations amount. And there's been quite a bit of work done in this area. And some numbers range between 100 and 150 trillion dollars. It doesn't have to be paid all at once. We're not going to spend all of this. This is why I'm talking about permanent kind of new framework for the global economy that reverses the flow for years to come, right? And start building this climate mitigation. We're not saying spend $100 trillion this year and hyperinflate the world. We're saying start on a massive scale by building the capacity in the global South, in the global North, in order to start repairing the damage. So that's why this has to be a permanent kind of reparations program. We're talking about 400 plus years worth of damage. It's not going to be repaired in 10 years, but we can start on a massive scale. And hopefully by the end of the century, we'll meet the challenge of climate change that scientists have set for us. And it's not going to happen unless we start immediately on a rapid decarbonization scale, like the IPCC report has suggested and many other experts have highlighted.
Next question is, what are some examples of countries in the global South that are working on these reparations?
So if some of you have heard the Barbados Prime Minister's speech maybe a month and a half ago, well, more than that, it was in December. Small island states are the ones that are literally sinking in the ocean and facing these challenges. They're the ones that are leading the effort for shifting the international framework away, hopefully soon, away from the concept of loss damage fund, which is let's wait for the climate event to hit and then we'll give you compensation. Shifting away from that to actually what I prefer to call a reparations fund that actually starts building the resilient infrastructure today. I'll give you an example. A country like Nauru in the Pacific Islands, small island of 10,000 people that literally has mined the island out of existence because of phosphate exports. And there's literally no water left on the island, no capacity to produce food, housing that's decades old and overcrowded. The country is now looking at literally building on higher grounds to stay afloat, right? Who's going to pay for it? For a country that's dependent on food imports, energy imports, and is isolated I mean, literally food shipments arrive once every 2 weeks. And if there's a weather event and food is delayed, people panic, right? This is the kind of stress and anxiety that some people are living under right now, not in 2050, but those events will happen across the world. So it's those kind of canaries in the coal mine today who are calling and organizing around alternative framework for climate mitigation, and those are the countries that I hope will be leading the calls for reparations. A country like Bolivia, not today, but in the last 15, 20 years, has called for climate reparations. Maybe not using the exact terminology, but recognizing the damage to indigenous communities from colonial history and extractive industries and so on. So there's lots of kind of bits and pieces of this kind of happening in the background. Hopefully in the next year or two, you'll see more of those. I'm dedicating as much time as I can to helping in these efforts. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm a little passionate about this stuff.
Next, we have a question from Andrew. What does your vision of climate equity look like with regard to intellectual property and transitioning to sustainable energy infrastructure?
Very good question, which I didn't have time to include in the presentation. Otherwise, we'll be here for 2 hours. So intellectual property rights and intellectual property theft is usually something you hear about, is that all these developing countries stealing our intellectual property and knockoff products and things like that. Nobody talks about decades, centuries worth of intellectual property theft from the global south, right? So when you think of our level of scientific and intellectual capabilities today, globally, a lot of it is built upon the very foundations that were developed by Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Persian civilization, Arab and Muslim civilization, African civilization. All of that intellectual development in mathematics and medicine, where's the intellectual property rights to it, right? Intellectual property rights were invented with capitalism recently, like a couple of centuries ago, basically. And the enforcement of those laws started from there, right? So if you're Google, if you're a big tech company, you're using mathematics and physics and algorithms, where's the intellectual property rights of the people who actually came up with those scientific innovations? Nothing, right? Forget about the old kind of civilizations and their contributions to our human capabilities today that has been privatized, right, by Silicon Valley, by everybody else. Think about biopiracy today, happening today, the theft of intellectual property from indigenous communities in the area of chemistry and medicine and beyond. Where are the court cases? Where are the reparations, the compensations for that kind of pharmaceutical theft that is happening this day? So there's plenty of literature to make the case for reparations and to make the case that certain basic resources like access to food, health, and energy, clean energy, these things should be exempt from so-called intellectual property rights. Why? Because of the principle of impossibility, the principle of necessity that I described earlier, which says if it's a question of life and death, intellectual property rights should be exempt. And we're actually experiencing this as we speak. When you see the cases around the COVID vaccines, when South Africa and China and other developing countries said, we can produce this. We know the formula, we have the pharmaceutical capacity to produce the vaccines. What did Pfizer say? What did the WTO say? The US and the UK said, no, you can't do that. We invented this thing, we're going to produce it and sell it to you. And we're nice, we'll sell it to you at a discount, right? When it's a question of life and death, right? International human rights says you can break into private property to save a child from a burning building, right? It is legal to do that in the US, to break into private property to save somebody's life. That's the principle of necessity. You have to do it. So here we're making the case that you have to save people's lives with the vaccine, with renewable energy, with food security, with climate mitigation for resilient infrastructure. You have to do it. Under any circumstance, it has to be done, including a reparations program or exemption from intellectual property rights and so on. So that's why I include transfer of technology, not as in we're selling them technology. I'm talking about actual transfer of technological capabilities exempt from intellectual property rights and so on.
Coming on to our last couple of questions here. We have one that says, how can we expect the IMF and World Bank to step up and provide the healing needed for these countries?
I don't. They're not going to do it unless we change the policy framework, right? So the IMF, the World Bank, they're international organizations, right? Who holds the veto power in the IMF and the World Bank? It's the US, right? So that's something to recognize on day one. The US has a veto power over policies of the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF, though, has the policy tools to implement everything I described today. In terms of transfer of resources, there's a thing called SDR, Special Drawing Rights, which is kind of an international monetary unit that only countries use at the IMF. You and I don't have SDRs. SDRs, all countries have a little allocated budget of SDRs that they are allowed to draw from. That's why it's called special drawing rights, in order to pay for their needs during an economic crisis as needed. But it's a very small amount. There's no reason for that not to be a massive, large amount. So my proposal for a climate reparations fund is actually to take the SDR system, which we have right now in the international system, and make it the actual reparations fund. And the IMF can implement it. I'll give you another example of something that we have today and that the Federal Reserve Bank uses today, the ECB uses. They're called swap lines that the Fed creates with other central banks that they choose selectively, the privileged ones. There's a swap line between the Fed and the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Swiss bank, privileged banks. And it's meant essentially as an unlimited lending kind of account from the Fed to these central banks in order to help them stabilize the value of the euro, of the Japanese yen during times of crisis, like now, during COVID, during the 2008 crisis. There's no reason for that fund, for that mechanism, the swap lines, not to be open to everybody, instead of just a few privileged banks, central banks like Europe and European Central Bank and so on. We know it works because it does stabilize the value of the euro and the yen and the Swiss franc. We know it works, but it's an exclusive privilege to a handful of central banks that we offer temporarily. And it doesn't have to be run by the Fed. It can be run by the IMF, by some international organization. So again, democratizing access to tools that are designed and are known to stabilize economic systems. So there has to be some tweaking that can be done to existing tools that we know are effective. And that's part of the proposal that I didn't get a chance to present today, but thank you for the question. It allowed me to show that there is actually a financial mechanism that is known to work effectively in this space that can be generalized.
All right, there is just one last question in the chat. Do you have any recommended resources or information about who has estimated the carbon reparation costs?
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier that Bolivia in the last 15 years or so did quite a bit of work in this space, and I can't point you to somebody off the top of my head, but there's a lot of work. If you send me an email, I'm happy to share this. But Bolivia-related climate action is where these estimates have been done, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned Bolivia today in the presentation. So thanks for the connection again.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this event, putting your questions in the chat. If anyone has any other last thoughts, questions, please put them in the chat now. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience. But thanks so much, everyone. Hope to see you at another talk in this environmental justice series.